Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 30, Section 5, World War II ends. So, the Battle of Okinawa, which was one of our last major battles of World War II, was also a very deadly battle. Roughly 12,000 American soldiers and nearly 100,000 Japanese died in this battle. The battle itself starts near April 1st, lasts until June 22nd, 1945. It is considered one of the last of the major battles using foot soldiers during World War II. The one thing I should mention, unlike some of the other battles, this is a battle that involved a lot of Japanese civilians. When you talk about the casualty count, and just so you understand the word casualty, this includes people who were killed and people who were injured in battle. Roughly 160,000 people were casualties in this battle alone, and that includes a lot of civilians. The Japanese soldiers had coerced the civilians living on Okinawa to kind of take up arms against the Americans, whether it be on their free will or under coercion. Needless to say, there were many of these civilians living on Okinawa who had bought into the propaganda that the Japanese had fed them, thinking that the United States was going to do them more harm. And there were a number of civilians that committed mass suicide, literally going to the cliffs near the sea and jumping off the cliffs with their children in their hands. It was devastating. The Japanese soldiers had actually given some of the civilians grenades. They told some of them to throw them, and the others they told to pull the pin to detonate the grenades once the soldiers, American soldiers, got close. So just a very gruesome type of war or battle itself. The Japanese had hewn a lot of secret passages and tunnels within the volcanic rock of the island. If you ever read stories about the account of this battle, you might hear American soldiers and their accounts of Sugarloaf Hill, which was kind of a Japanese holdout and a source of a lot of misery for American soldiers. Many of our American casualties died trying to take this hill. When you talk about Okinawa, this is it on the map. If you take a look here where the arrow tip is, it is due west of Iwo Jima, and it is one of the southernmost islands of that Japanese archipelago or the mainland of Japan. And with the number of civilians that were involved in this battle, there was a lot of concern about what the war might look like once the American soldiers land on the Japanese homeland. Certainly, there was a great concern that this was not going to be a very easy war and it could take years for us to defeat Japan. Hence, the desire to kind of wrap this war up faster. And thus, we got to talk about the atomic bomb. Kind of starting around 1940, there was a desire to do something with this technology. In the late 1930s, the atom had actually been split, and a number of physicists were concerned of who might potentially have the power to utilize this information and to make it into a weapon. There was great fear that the Nazis were actually working on building their own atomic bomb. And thus, some of these physicists went to American President Franklin Roosevelt to ask whether or not he would consider uh, maybe getting in the arms race, maybe to make his own bomb. Hence, this becomes known as the Manhattan Project. It was a secret project that utilized a lot of civilians and physicists and military personnel to make this atomic bomb in a number of sites around the United States. And the man that heads this all up is a guy, physicist in this case, J. Robert Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer and his crew, they head out to New Mexico. And matter of fact, they make their bomb and they tested in July of 1945. And shortly thereafter, they're going to have to pack it up and send it overseas. And the weapon itself, you got Little Boy, which was a plutonium bomb or a uranium bomb, excuse me, and Fat Man, which was a plutonium bomb. These bombs were packed up and they were put on a ship known as the USS Indianapolis, and it was ferried off to Tinian Island. Um, and as a result, the bomb itself would be delivered by aircraft. Just a little side note about the Indianapolis: when the ship left harbor in San Francisco, it was heavily guarded. Matter of fact, there were Marines on the ship that were guarding primarily the bomb itself. The bombs were welded to the deck of the ship so that nobody could steal them, which I think it would be kind of hard to do considering the weight. But needless to say, the crew on board didn't realize what was on board. They just knew that they had something very important that they were hauling. They also were ordered not to use their radios. And so as the ship travels across the Pacific, they are in radio silence. They get to Tinian and they unload their cargo, if you want to call it that. And the bombs themselves are prepared so that they can be used for delivery, meaning that they can be dropped. The ship itself then is supposed to zigzag around in the Pacific, and after it leaves Tinian Island, it actually is sunk by a Japanese submarine. It got torpedoed, and as the ship is sinking, they can't crawl for help. They're under radio silence. In the warm waters of the Pacific, in that region, there were a number of sharks. And if you've ever seen the movie Jaws, this was the real deal. Matter of fact, the movie Jaws is um, kind of taken off from the story of this shipwreck of the Indianapolis. Needless to say, there were people who died on this ship. Matter of fact, there was a man from my hometown that died on this ship that I've heard lots and lots of stories as I was growing up about this. But there were a number of men who survived literally by treading water and fighting off the sharks in the process. It was a horrifying event. So sometimes we forget about those side stories, and this is a very important one because it was brutal. But when we talk about the delivery of the bombs, you got to talk about Colonel Paul Tibbets and the crew of the Enola Gay. The Enola Gay is an aircraft that's actually named after Colonel Paul Tibbets' mother. And the aircraft is very special because it was built in Nebraska. The plane itself was built at the Martin Bomber Plant, which today is located on Offutt Air Force Base. And Tibbets and his crew, they came to Bellevue and they handpicked this aircraft. This aircraft is a B-29 Super Flying Fortress. This plane was probably the top of the line at the time it was built. One thing that you should note is that unlike other aircraft of this era of time, this is a plane that was entirely pressurized, meaning like it's probably more in line with like your passenger jets that you fly on today, meaning that when you get in, the cabin is sealed, your ears might pop a little bit, but it's the idea that you don't have to have an oxygen mask on you when you fly at a high altitude, and it's at high altitude that gives it its uh, opportunities to drop this payload. Okay, Hiroshima, just so you know, is basically a city on the coast. Nagasaki is a city in the hills. The bomb that is dropped on Hiroshima probably is a little bit probably does more damage than the bomb at Nagasaki, even though it's not as strong. Um, the deal is the geography because Nagasaki is kind of in a hilly mountainous terrain. The mountains that surround it kind of dampen the full effect of the bomb, and it doesn't do as much damage as the bomb that is dropped on Hiroshima a few days later. So, on August 6th, 1945, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The Allies would repeat this again on August the 9th when they drop a bomb on Nagasaki. Now, the question is what the impact was. And you can see the mushroom cloud when the the crew that dropped both the bombs, when they were in the process of getting ready to drop their payload, they were told to don on these goggles, which to me would probably be no different than like if you've worn a welder's mask, very, very dark, with the idea that there was going to be um, some bright light that's going to happen with that. So within about a minute or so after the bomb was dropped, the masks were put on, and yes, there was a huge bright light that obviously these people on the crew could see. A number of photos were taken by other planes that were flying with the Enola Gay and the boxcar which carried the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. But I want to mention some things about the photographs that I have here in the middle. We didn't realize what the true impact of these bombs was going to be. We knew that they had a lot of firepower, and we understood that when we tested them or tested a bomb in New Mexico. But we didn't realize what the wide range impact could be on civilians. The photo that you see kind of right here, I'm running my cursor over, you see a number of people kind of sitting around. I want to point out kind of this lady here. Looks like she's got, some baggy clothes on, but that's not clothes. That's her skin. Uh, One of the things that you started seeing in cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki within a day or so afterwards was the enormity of the burns that people had, skin peeling off because of the high dosage of radiation that people received. When you talk about the blast power, okay, you can kind of see the map of Japan where Hiroshima and Nagasaki are located, but the map that you see below here is a before and after of the city of Hiroshima, where the X's or where the kind of the point of the arrow is kind of where the bomb was detonated. Um, Before and after, you could see the city afterwards. There was not much left. The thing that should be mentioned is that in parts of Hiroshima, uh, there's a story about a bank that is located very close to where this targeted X is, and a worker had actually gone into the vault almost at the moment that the bomb was detonated and was one of the sole survivors at this, kind of this epicenter of the bomb. And it was because of that steel reinforced bank vault that they happened to be in. Had they been outside of it, they would have been burnt to death. You had several people that said that the temperature was that of like the sun, and literally people vaporized near the epicenter here. When you talk about other unusual things, you see the cement on the upper two pictures. Literally, the shadows of people were burned into those pieces of pavement. Um, the upper one, you actually have a person who probably was sitting here in the upper right hand corner. This is more of a shadow of someone. When you talk about the severity of the burns, um, you had burns like this on a lot of people, people that literally were near the epicenter, but not so close that they were burnt alive. Talking about radiation so bad that literally a day or so afterwards, the fingernails on their hands and the hair on their head were literally coming off in chunks. Um, in Hiroshima today, you might see this building. This is located very close to where ground zero was for this bomb, and it still stands. It's one of the only buildings that was able to withstand the attack on August 6th. Anyway, after the war, much of Europe and Asia laid in ruins, and so the national economies were both near collapse. Millions of displaced people had to rebuild their lives. There was a lot of concern about the spread of communism and Soviet influences. And as a result, the Allies, in this case, when we talk about Japan, the United States makes a decision to occupy Japan and help rebuild it. When you talk about the surrender of Japan, this comes literally a handful of days after the dropping of the bomb on Nagasaki. And right around the beginning of September of 1945, officially a delegation of Japanese soldiers and dignitaries come aboard the USS Missouri, a battleship that we talked about previously with kamikaze attacks, came aboard the ship to sign the surrender. You can see the number of sailors that are watching this. If you look at the other ships, there are sailors that are standing watching as well. I have a dear friend of mine who has passed away a handful of years ago, who farmed down the road from my folks, who was on one of those ships the day that this was signed and can remember this very clearly. So, thank you very much.